For ages, the Arab world has lived in darkness, but now is the time to cut the curtains and let the light of democracy shine through. In my speech, I'm going to be proving to you that it is fundamental to ban religious parties from participating in elections in the newly democratized Arab nations. But before I do that, let me talk a bit about definitions and the model we want to use in this debate. The newly democratized nations are countries such as Libya, Egypt, or Tunisia, which are going through a process of democratization right now, and the religious parties are such political parties that advocate the use of religion as the main source of legitimacy in policy making and in a way of governing a country. For the model, we believe that the eligibility of a party to participate in elections should be judged by an independent court, which would therefore decide whether or not the party should be allowed to run for elections. And that brings me to the 2 points I'm going to be talking about in my speech. The first one is being about the importance of democracy, and the second one is being about the potential harms presence of religious parties in elections should and could pose to the newly democratized nations. So let me begin straight with the idea of democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, democracy is the best system of governing a society. And it is for 2 main reasons. The first one is that it allows everyone in society to have an equal say, and therefore everyone is allowed to participate in policy making and in choosing their own government. And secondly, democracy ensures that the system is self-correcting. That means that if a party makes an unpopular decision, it can be voted out in the elections to come, and therefore the opinion of the people is always voiced. And for these reasons, democracy should be protected, and there should be means to protect democracy from distortion or from being destroyed outright. And we see this happening around the world, clearly. We see this happening in Europe with the case of fascist parties, which are being banned for the very reason that there is a potential harm they could pose, that they could destroy democracy, and therefore they could ensure that the process of equality no longer works. This is what we do not want. So basically, in this speech, my fundamental task is to prove that these religious parties pose a harm to democracy, which I'm going to do right now. And it is on a few levels. The first one deals with the principle and why religious parties should not be allowed to run for elections. It is important to realize that religious parties are monotheistic. That means that in the case of Islam, they believe only in one God, and they say that their God is the most important and the best in the world. And they base their policies upon this premise. And again, this tends to oppose anything that defies the ideas of the party and the thoughts. They are not in accordance with what Islamist parties think. But the problem here is, ladies and gentlemen, that we cannot objectively distinguish between a good and a bad religion. If we could do that, there would possibly be, wait a moment, sir, there would possibly be only one religion which would be used to govern every single state in the world. Yes,
but you also can't decide whether a secular party is good or bad. There's no difference in religion. It's about party.
A secular party, the main difference between a secular and a religious party is that the secular party is ready to participate in the free process of elections and is ready to take the role of a loyal opposition if the time comes. But this is not the case with religious parties. And I'm going to move to that point right now and talk a bit about why the presence of religious parties in the government takes the principle of rationalism, which should be presented in decision making, and the people in democracy should be deciding rationally and on the basis of what they believe is important and good for them or the society they live in. But this is not happening in the case of religious parties. Because religious parties can just come up and say that they should be voted for because they are the right Muslims. And every single good Muslim should vote for the religious party. And no matter what the actual policies of the party are, the people in the country, which are in the great majority Islamist, should be and are voting, no sir, thank you, should be voting for this party according to this presumption. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, principally wrong, because we should care about what the party wants to do, and we should not be voting based on who is or is not a good Muslim. This is straight in direct contradiction with the principle of equality and democracy. We should be deciding only based on what the party says it will do. And that brings me to the last point, which deals with what could possibly happen if the party got to government and got the majority of votes, and therefore be the party, in fact, running the whole country. The main examples of this happening could be the National Transmission Committee in Libya or the Islamist parties, the Al-Nur Salafist party in Egypt, which promised the establishment of Sharia law on the state level once they're elected, which they will be in this case. And what this means for the people in the country is, for example, the fact that every single woman in the society will be obliged to wear a burqa in public, and therefore infringing upon the basic right of democracy, which is the right to equality. Yes, sir.
These parties also, in the same addresses, reaffirm their conviction to the rights of women. Are you aware of that fact?
Yes, I'm perfectly aware of that fact, but the problem is that it may be only something which the party says in order to be elected, and because they are Islamist, and they, on the other hand, enshrine such traditions as is the Sharia law, we can see that there could be a possible infringement on the human rights in the future, such as we see in the case of the Salafist movement. And the problem in this case is that there is a power vacuum present in these countries. And the power vacuum and the gap needs to be filled. And with whom? It's going to be most likely filled with the countries that are Islamist and used to be in opposition during the old regimes, which is, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood, on one hand, says that they are the good Muslims and therefore they will be voted for, and on the other, it is the party the people know the most, so that they will be voted for the most likely. And that means that there is an even bigger danger to the basic rights that should be connected with democracy. And we cannot afford that. We have to ensure that everybody in the society has an equal say and everybody is free to voice their opinions, which is not likely to happen in the case of religious parties. So I beg you to ban religious parties in the Arab world outright. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, by preventing 70% of the people of Egypt of expressing their political adherence, we are not protecting democracy. We are killing democracy. Democracy cannot exist for 30% of the people. And this is something that we, as the opposition in today's debate, will talk about throughout the course of the whole debate. Ladies and gentlemen, democracy, we believe, is something that should represent the people and what the people want. And the democratic regime that the proposition itself strives for can only be sustainable if the people's opinions are included in the political process. Ladies and gentlemen, in my first opposition speech, I will first address the points of harms and how these political parties, for some unknown reason, are supposedly harms to democracy. Then I will move on to our first point, which itself talks about democracy, then to the second point about the negative consequences and the practical side of the motion, and after that the second speaker will also talk about means of control when a party gains power. So, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, we have heard that religious parties are a harm to democracy. But the only support that we have been given is a quote by someone saying that they want to impose Sharia law. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if at the same time they're saying that we cannot believe religious leaders when they say that they want a democratic system, how can they want that point to stand? Ladies and gentlemen, I have several quotes here of, for example, no thank you, even the so hard-line and conservative Salafi Noor Party of Egypt. They themselves have said that they do not want an Islamic regime, but a democratic regime. They have pledged to honor the treaty with Israel and are committed to turning Egypt into a democratic regime. Ladies and gentlemen, because democracy is something that we so value, we think that it can only be restricted if we have a substantial amount of proof that the country that is going to gain power will exclude democracy from the process, will put the opposition parties away, and we have no proof that something like this will happen. No, thank you, sir. More about the harm. Ladies and gentlemen, what difference is there between a religious party that has a certain ideology and any other ideology, whether it is believing in liberalism, no thank you sir, in socialism, in conservatism, or even things like communism, for example? Ladies and gentlemen, all of these political ideas and ideologies have their own values, and these values often come in absolutes, right? For example, a conservative politician will never be for gay marriages or so on. Ladies and gentlemen, and we believe that this is something that is completely okay and that is an integral part of the political process, especially in these countries where religion is something that is embedded in the cultural identity of these people. No, thank you. And we only restrict parties from being part of the process if they pose a harm, right? So a socialist party normally can be part of the process, but is restricted if it becomes, or for example, with the fascist parties, if it becomes a threat to democracy, ladies and gentlemen. And because these religious parties are not, we believe that it is wrong to exclude them from the process. So unlike the secular regimes that these countries, no thank you, have gotten rid of, the secular regimes in, for example, Syria, which is still an ongoing regime, or the regimes of the dictatorships that were there, that were a threat to democracy, ladies and gentlemen, these religious parties have shown no such tendency. Two researchers at the University of North Carolina studied 86 elections in 20 countries in the Muslim society over the past 40 years. They found that in order to gain support, these parties liberalize. In order to gain the most possible number of votes, which is in the middle of the political spectrum, so neither liberal people nor radical people, these parties want to be moderate, to appeal to the moderate voter, ladies and gentlemen. And these parties liberalize and they stay liberalized. This is something that was, no thank you, that was proved by the study. So ladies and gentlemen, these parties, as I have already said about the Salafi party, are committed to a democratic regime. And unless we have proof that they will not be able to live and be in power in a democratic regime, it is completely unjustified and immoral to destroy democracy, no thank you sir, in this way. So, moving on to the second part of my analysis, which is again combined with the fact how religion is an important part of Arab political life. Ladies and gentlemen, many people have already expressed their adherence to political parties. As I've already said, in Egypt it's altogether more than 70%. In Tunisia it was 40% of the people that said they would want an Islamist party to govern their country. So, this means two things in practical sense. First of all, if enforced, this policy would solve nothing. As I have already said, the truth is that even parties that aren't officially religious have religious members and have religious values, because religion is something that is integral in the conservative political thought of Arab countries and embedded in their culture. The distinguishment between individual parties regarding Islam is not very clear. What's more, and I'll tell you in just a second, a party that has been banned can be easily transformed into a new party with a slightly different name and program, and this is something that the Czech Republic knows very well. That is something that has happened in their own country when the Workers' Party, an extremist right-wing party, was banned, but only 3 days later, a new party with the same members was formed. Suspiciously, yes, sir.
In your analysis about the religious members of a party, yes, we agree a lot of the parties have religious members. What is important in our definition that we have stated is whether or not this is a justification for the policies. This is what you're neglecting.
Sir, as I've already said, justification for policies is always in the ideology of the people, of the members of the parties. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have to realize is that there is no difference between a religious party and a non-religious party when it comes to democracy. Religious parties are an integral part of the political process all over the world. And unless they pose a threat to freedom, there is no reason for restricting them. No, sir. So moving on to my second argument that I've begun, the first part of which was about how this policy would solve nothing, because, first of all, religion is something that is in the culture of these countries. Secondly, a party can become a different party. So the second part of this analysis of the practical side is the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that not allowing to vote for someone who represents your opinions causes great dissatisfaction and radicalization. If 70% of the population of Egypt is not allowed to express their political adherence, ladies and gentlemen, they will feel ostracized, they will feel discriminated by the government, lose trust in it, stop considering themselves citizens. Ladies and gentlemen, this type of action leads to violence, leads to radicalization, and this causes great instability. And not only of the members, of the voters of these political parties, but also the parties themselves, who would feel discriminated by the system and would try to gain power and recognition through force. So ladies and gentlemen, this would include even extremist movements that may not have had support beforehand, but because this motion would support the hostility in the people, they would be more likely to support even extreme parties and put the undemocratic or discriminatory system that the proposition wants to inflict upon these people away. So ladies and gentlemen, because we believe that democracy in its essence is something that is essential in these new countries, in these countries where they have lived in dictatorial regimes, in these countries where they have revolted against those regimes, protested against them, and finally been able to exclude them and make the people go away, and where these people have been calling for democracy, and hand in hand with democracy have been calling for Islam, have been calling for something that they feel represents them, which democracy is about. And a proposition needs to take this of what democracy is truly about. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no reason to restrict democracy this way. And not only that, it would have great practical negative consequences of the radicalization of the people. Thank you very much.
Rule by religion is only legitimate in a society where there is 100% consensus about that religion, where 100% of the society believes that it is true. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not debating about Vatican City. We are debating about a diverse part of the world that is the Arab world. Ladies and gentlemen, in my speech I will be principally talking about the threats that radical Islam in government faces to religious minorities and also to women. Now, before I talk about our constructive line of argumentation, I would like to rebut to what the first opposition speaker has brought to the table. Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, we both sides agree on the importance of democracy. But let me repeat some of the justifications we propose for this ban. Firstly, because democracy is the best system, because it is the most self-correcting system under normal conditions, we should do everything to protect it. But we have to be aware that the newly democratized Arab world does not operate under normal conditions of democracy. So we have to do everything to try to protect this self-correcting mechanism from emerging. Now, they told us that we're not democratic because 70% of the people believe in radical Islam in government. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we do not think this is reflective of what the people want truly, because this is just their own belief. Instead, we have to realize that people in the Arab world were not exposed to democracy for a long time. They were not able to talk about politics. They're not politically aware. The only thing that most of them are aware of is religion. And when they do not know what they want, if they want socialism or something else, then they want religion. And we do not think that this presents the best option to them. Now, one point that was raised in the speech was the idea of moderation, that these parties are actually moderate. And interestingly enough, they raised the Salafi party as a party that said that they are actually moderate and that they would protect democracy. But let's ask ourselves, if you were candidating in free democratic elections, would you actually be saying, no, we will fully abolish democracy? Would that be the platform that you use to appeal to the vast majority of people? What we see this moderation to be, in many cases, is an almost farce. They're suggesting one thing, and they will do another once they're in power. And we believe that this is essentially true, because religious worship, by its religion of the monotheistic sort, is by its very nature demands the conversion of others, something I will raise in my constructive argumentation. Now, a second point that was raised was a comparison about the nature of politics. But before I take that, I will take your point, sir.
Sir, you have to demonstrate why the mere fact that the party bases its policies on religious grounds is reason to ban them.
Yes, sir. As I've said just a minute ago, I will do this in my constructive case. But before I do that, I would like to talk about the nature of politics. They basically said that religious ideology is not at all different from, for example, a legitimate political ideology such as socialism. But we do not believe that this is the case. Some of the worst political movements in the past, such as communism and fascism, were bad because they were not open to criticism. That was the bad thing about these ideologies. And let's think about religion. A religion that openly says that what is written in the Quran is infallible. Is this something that is necessarily open to criticism? Is this something that can operate in a democracy and be open to rational criticism of others? No, sir. Now, throughout this point, they illustrated things such as studies and so forth, showing that these parties are liberalizing for moderation to get bigger support. But again, we say that this is only a mask they use to, only in the election process, and that once they get into power, they will slowly change the society according to the vision of Islam. Now, one of the last things they raised was the interesting point about efficiency, about radicalization. And he said that once we ban these parties, that they will resort to such things as violence, that they will promote instability. But we find it funny that implicitly they already suggest that these people will take the most violent route. Instead of going down a policy of passive resistance, they are implicitly acknowledging that these people are prone to violence, which is the case with such movements as the Muslim Brotherhood, which until recently was listed as a terrorist organization according to the United States. So, are these really the parties we want to have in power? No, thank you, sir. Now, moving on to our own constructive argumentation, which deals primarily with religious intolerance and women under the system. Firstly, we have to realize that, again, these parties base themselves on Islam, which is fundamentally a monotheistic religion. Now, what this essentially means is the traditional mantra of Islam. There is only one God and Allah is His Prophet. Now, as we've said before, this means that these religions are, in their sense, not very willing to compromise on some of their tenets. And that in some places in the Quran, they openly advocate the forced conversion of others through various means. For example, in Surah 39, verse 9, they suggest that we should, for example, levy a tax on non-believers such as Jews and Christians. Yes, sir? Yes.
So you realize that there are many different political parties, each of which says something different. And in the Quran itself, it says that the individual has a right to interpret it.
Well, I do not think that it really suggests that you have the right to interpret it, because it is presented openly as the word of God. And this is something that isn't actually so open to interpretation. And one of the things is that there might exist various interpretations, but in Egypt we have two majority parties that are more or less unanimous in some of the things that they say. So the fact that there are various interpretations around the Muslim world might seem important, but it's not in the Arab world, where some of the beliefs are the same for majority of parties. Now, let's take an implication of this religious intolerance that is implicit in these political ideologies and place it in the context of a country like Egypt. Egypt has a 10% religious minority of Coptic Christians. Now, these Coptic Christians have a long tradition of living in Egypt. In fact, at one point, they were the majority religion in that country. So they have a certain right to live there as a normal citizen. But what actually side opposition proposes, what side opposition suggests the implications of what they suggest will happen is that once parties like the Muslim Brotherhood, once parties like Al-Noor Salafist Party will get into power, they will levy this so-called jizya. They will levy this special tax, especially from the Jews and Coptic Christians. Now, in this we see implicitly a coercion. They are putting a financial incentive for these people to convert. They are putting one religion on an unequal footing with another. And this, we believe, is a recognition of the inequality inherent in some of their religious policies. And this is not a good thing for democracy to do, because democracy should view all people equally, because otherwise the self-correcting mechanism doesn't work. Now, I find it a particularly fitting point to have the last constructive point in my speech to be about gender equality, especially because we are in a primarily female school. Now, we have to realize that Islam by its nature is very patriarchal, that it's very male-centered, and even more so that these societies are, such as Egypt and so forth. And many of these parties, such as the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, has said that it believes freedom should cohere with the idea of Sharia. And Sharia, the various interpretations of Sharia, propose things such as forcing all women to wear burqas, which is something that the Al-Noor Party has proposed as well. And in Sharia itself, there's some implicit inequality between men and women. For example, if you make a contractual obligation, you might have two men, or you might have one man and two women, which implicitly suggests that one man is worth two women, which I'm quite sure that many females in this room will disagree with. Now, essentially, we believe that a religious party in power will, by its very nature of its religion, propose these inequalities. And in fact, many of these parties have outright said that they would do it. Would we actually stand and agree with parties that banning Coptic Christians for standing for presidency, banning women from standing for presidency. This is an expression of intolerance that we should not stand for. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to oppose because I am sure that it's not right to throw all the religious parties into one bag just because the team of proposition brought out some statement that does not sound very peacefully. Ladies and gentlemen, why am I proud to propose is that if we were quoting Bible, we would probably come to the same conclusion to gender inequality, etc. Ladies and gentlemen, but what is important is that politics and democratic open society does not work this way, and what do people in these countries want is not a gender inequality. What do these people want is democracy and free election. This is what the women in those countries want, and this is what in the end of the day also the parties want, because they need the votes of people in order to be elected and be in power, ladies and gentlemen. In my speech, I will try to address some points. The first will be the point of threat to democracy. If really these parties are or are not threat to democracy, I will also talk about the set of values and about criticism and openness of these religious parties, and I will also address the gender equality point and point of radicalization, and then I will propose my split argument that will be about that even if those parties want it for some unknown reason turn radical, it would be basically enable them because the international scene and their people will not let them do that. Ladies and gentlemen, so now let's take a look on if these countries are, these parties are a threat to democracy. We fully realize that these are newly democratized system. But what we believe is that these people were fighting for democracy. That is what they want. And we do not believe that it's right to just come there and for some unknown reason, no thank you, forbid 60% of the country the right to vote for someone who expressed their opinions. The statements brought by proposition were not fully true, and what is important is that these parties truly are moderate. It is in their basis to turn moderate because it is what gains them vote, because most people are not radical, not even in these countries. No, most people are moderate, therefore it is called moderate. It's called mainstream because the most people is like that. What is important that also another party in Tunisia said that it believes non-Islamic groups, including Christians, should get a voice in writing. No, thank you. A new constitution. This is, ladies and gentlemen, what these parties are proposing, and I beg proposition to stop putting words in the mouths of these groups, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so now let's move to the point of radicalization. What is important is that if they claim that here is a self-correcting system that is so good, then we do not see any reason for stopping the self-correcting system, imposing our values, those we believe are true, and giving these people something they do not want at all. They have their own set of values, they have their own politics, so let's let them rule their country the way they want until they restrict democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, what we also believe is that there is the self-correcting system. We saw this in those countries. That is the reason why those countries turned democratic. And we saw it in Egypt when the militant government seemed like not becoming democratic. Well, the people went out to the streets again and fought for what they wanted to reach. Because, no thank you, what they really want is democracy. That's what we see on every single step, so stop lying to each other. What is also important is that they are saying that Islam is something that is not open to anything and is united in thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 73 waves of Islam inside the Islam, ladies and gentlemen. This Islam, no thank you, itself is not united. What is also important is that the reason why there is not one Islamic party, but like 50 Islamic parties, is that also Islamic parties want different things and want to propose things in different ways. So therefore we believe that if we want them to become critical, if we want them to become open, we have to put them to the democratic system, because it is the only system that will make them do this. And on the other side, if we want them to radicalize, if we want them to be like saying statesmen, those is saying proposition, well, then let's forbid them and let's see what will they do. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that these people have their thoughts they do want to propose, and if we will not let them express them, they will feel betrayed. 60% of people will feel betrayed. 60% of people will not feel like no thank you, like their opinions being expressed, and this is something, ladies and gentlemen, that should not happen. Also, if we want to solve the gender equality, we anyway can just come there and put it in front of them. Gender equality and all of these kind of things are things those have to get in some natural process, and that is something that we'll get if we will propose democracy that is truly right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's move to means of control. What is important is that when parties like these are included in the democratic process, they are suddenly responsible for running the economy and in charge of making decisions. Those can greatly influence the nation. They are no longer in the position from which they can only criticize the government or give promise they do not intend to keep. On the other side, it is in their own interest to make decisions. Those are approved both by the people and by international scene. By the people because they want to gain votes in the election, and by the international scenes is that because all these countries have economic ties, those do not let them to make decisions. Those will resolve to sanction them. Additionally, most religious parties wouldn't probably have enough votes to form a coalition on its own. Therefore, the coalition they would all have to form will be another tool for controlling their action. Yes, sir.
But you just said, throughout your speeches, you say they have 70% majority, and yet they cannot form a government?
Yes, sir. It is 70% for more Islamic party, not for one Islamic parties. And therefore we see that they are not inconsistent, they have to make compromises. That is what coalition does. Furthermore, the government will be under constant scrutiny from the outside world, and since these countries are dependent on economic ties and tourism from countries, especially in the West, it limits the range of their policies. Unlike, for example, Iran, the major trade partners of these countries is European Union, and the European Union is a coalition that strives for their trade partners to be moderate, and it can put sanctions or freeze their accounts if the human rights situation is worsening, as it was in case of Libya, Syria, or Iran, ladies and gentlemen. For these countries, it is inevitable to trade with the European Union, therefore they cannot do policies those would provoke sanctions on them. Furthermore, when a party gains power, it will be also be subject to control from the rest of the government and from the people as well. No party has enough support and will not get enough votes to be able to rule the country on its own. In Tunisia, another party won the election, and it also had to create a coalition with two another secular parties. Ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to oppose because we believe that religious parties are not threat to democracy. We do not see, and therefore we do not see the reason why should we ban them. Thanks for attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us transport ourselves into Iran in the year 1979. There was a movement for change, very much like the movement in the Arab world that we have just seen recently. They desired a change of regime. They did not want the oppression to last any longer, very much like we saw in 2011. And what this movement slowly became, by virtue of a strong religious force in its midst, was a radical theocracy. Something that is a threat to the current Arab world, and that might happen to the Arab world as we speak. So what we have to do is we have to ban those religious parties, this religious force that can turn those newly flourishing countries into something worse. So, like my speech, I'll focus on the four fundamental issues that we had in this debate. First one being the long-term prospects of the democracy. Secondly, the change of religious parties. Thirdly, I'll talk about the gender and minorities. And fourthly, I'll talk about the means of control as it was brought by the last speaker. Now, let me move on to the first issue of long-term prospects of democracy. I have 5 fundamental points to raise here. First of all, what we have heard is that it doesn't really matter what right now happens. But what we have to understand is right now it is the moment when constitutions are formed. Right now it is the time to decide how the state will look on for decades to come. And we have to understand that if something happens with the constitution, with the very fundamental principles that are right now being established, this can have so long-lasting consequences that we cannot let that happen into any kind of state. So what we see is that these policies can favor religious parties in the long term, as we have suggested down the bench, and these can slowly transform the regime into something that would not be as democratic as the parties seem to profess right now, and I'll deal with that point of analysis a little bit later. But what we've heard from the side opposition was that the views of the people are not upheld right now, and that 70% will be not represented. Well, this is firstly not true. These people, sure, they want certain kind of government in, they have that in mind. But what they do not understand on the side, no thank you, on the side of opposition is that those people have certain policies, certain views that can be sometimes rationalized out. And a lot of these things can still be represented under different parties. And we believe that what we do not want primarily is this discrimination that finds its only justification in the fundamentalist interpretation of those parties. So what we have to understand is that a lot of the views can still be represented by other parties. Now, thirdly, what we have to ask ourselves when talking about long-term prospects of democracy is whether or not we should have the right to abolish our own rights, our own right to actually sacrifice our own democracy. And what we say in the side proposition is no. Those people have to have these fundamental rights protected because that way they're more fundamentally theirs. This is a right to decide about your government every single 4 election years. And if there's a government policy that, for instance, discriminates against all of the Christians in the country, this is clearly something that infringes upon the Christian fundamental right, and this is something that ultimately it can distort the democratic process. No, thank you. And here we could probably, the side of opposition, probably raise the issue of self-correction and how really those parties can self-correct themselves. But we've already shown you that this doesn't work because those parties have a fundamental higher authority to appeal to. These countries these parties can always say, this is what God wants, this is what is just, and not reason about it. And this is the fundamental problem. Now, thank you. We see with the side proposition, and yes, we can see that ultimately this lack of accountability becomes an issue in many of the democracies. No, thank you. So last point that we probably hear is that, yes, we can argue about what is right and what is not right in Islam, that there's a discord in Islam. Yes, there are various interpretations. Their divergence, however, is not too great. They still agree on some of the most basic points. And what we have to see here, even if this was actually true, that they do not agree on the most fundamental things, which is yet to be shown. We don't believe that is actually true because most of the religious parties actually agree on those things. We still believe that there is something wrong because then you argue not about what is the best policy, but who's a better Muslim. And that is, again, something that distorts the democratic process that we want to enshrine into those countries. So let me move on without further ado to the second level, the change of religious parties. But before I do, I'll take you, yes.
But what we can see is that both Ananda, Muslim Brotherhood, and both also parties in other countries are fine with women having...
I'll get to that later. Thank you, sir. I'll get to this point in my third substantive. So let me move on to the change of religious parties. What we see here is that what the side of opposition has firstly suggested was the change of views, that they will become more moderate. But this doesn't make any sense fundamentally. Why? Because why would a religious party become more moderate after it's elected? No, it makes sense from the very nature of democracy to become more moderate before before the election happens so that you can get more votes. But you don't then see yourself liable because you have to fulfill the will of God and therefore you're going to become more fundamentalist after you're elected. No, thank you. When you have the power, when you're drafting the Constitution. This is something that they've never reacted to, and we believe that is a fundamental harm because those parties that are now professing sometimes, and I'll actually talk about that a little bit later, that it is fine with women in government, etc., will change their views, most likely because that's something what their core electorate wants, first of all. Second of all, this is how they got their mandate. This is what they believe is right according to their religion. Secondly, what they've said is that they might merely change the party. But we don't really see at this point of being any relevance, because then another party can be banned just as well. Thirdly, about the difference in Islam, I've already shown you how really they agree on most of the issues, and secondly, that even if they do not, it is an issue, because then the whole process becomes about the issue, who is the better Muslim. Thirdly, to the issue of gender and minority, and I'm answering your point here. What we believe is that, for instance, the United Party, the speaker of the party actually professed that, and I quote, that free mothers or alone mothers have no right to exist, because they're a sin to the society and to the family. So what we believe, no thank you, is that those views, yes, there might be certain discord in the party. However, what we believe that they agree on the issues of minorities and on religion, because that's something that is stated in Islam, and that they will ultimately, especially when they're elected, would go through with their proposals. And lastly, to the issue of means of control, as it was brought in the last speech. Well, what we can quote here, number of countries, Iran, Iraq, and stuff like that, that actually do not necessarily have these kind of means of control. There was no effective mechanism for Iran, Iraq. We were buying oil from them. Not to mention Saudi Arabia or Syria, which were selling oil to the United States of America, one of the most free countries in the world, and yet they did nothing about it. They were simply fine with that, with the state of the country, and we do not see any reason why this should be any different right now, because all of these countries still have their economic interests that they place above human rights consistently. So what I've shown you in my speech is that, firstly, the long-term prospect of the democracy are best upheld when we ban the religious parties. Secondly, that the religious parties can change only to be more radical, and that is fundamentally distorting the system. And I've shown you that they do not care about genders and minorities. So for all these reasons, I urge you to ban the religious parties.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a team of proposition have treated us today in this debate with was just a single big boogeyman of Islam looming over the countries of North Africa. What we have to understand is that this boogeyman is only their own conjunction, and it doesn't exist. And this I will do in my speech. I believe that in order for the proposition to win this debate, they have to show us that their policy is effective first, and then second, that they have some moral high ground and moral claim to why this policy should be put in place. So first, I will talk about the effectiveness of their own plan. And this point was brought about in our second speech and in our first speech as well, when we were talking about how basically these countries are Islamic countries, and Islam is the main force of the conservative political thought, and how therefore banning parties which are Islamic has no effect. Why is it so? Well, on the practical level, it is so because the party that is banned is usually banned on what they claim they want to do. So they are banned according to their program. They are banned according to some specific quotes from the program that are unconstitutional. Now what happens, and what happened in the Czech Republic as well, was that the Workers' Party, the fascist party in Czech Republic, managed to be refounded 3 days after it was banned the first time, simply, no thank you, and this party cannot be banned again, because they have amended they have amended their program in such a way that it now is above the legal standard. But the party continues to be the same fascist party it used to be. So this motion is ineffective. And now let's move to the moral imperatives and to the point about whether the state should limit political Islam in these countries. And I will deal with this in 2 points. First, I will show you why Islam and Islamic thought is a legitimate political force in these countries rather than a big boogeyman. And in the third point, I will show you why there are corrective mechanisms in place in these countries in order to prevent possible abuse of the system. So first of all, Islam is a legitimate political force. We believe that people vote parties in according to, first of all, the values they represent, second of all, the policies they propose. And now, what the team of proposition tried to argue was that the only justification these parties give in order to be elected is that you vote for us because then you were better Muslim than your neighbor. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe it is a very wrong perception on the side of the proposition, because they assume that the people in North Africa are simply ignorant, and this is not the case. These people know that, no thank you, what matters is the policy. Furthermore, they have demonstrated for democracy. Now, what this means? This means, no thank you sir, this means that they are willing to listen to these policy solutions. And what we believe is that political Islam brings these policy solutions just as any other political ideology. Just as you cannot delete political Islam from the Arab world, you cannot delete the political aspect of Christianity from the United States of America, for example. The policies are based, no thank you, on such a rationale that appeals to the people, and this is what we believe democracy is all about. It is about representing the people. And we see that these people are used to different things. They are used to certain standards in human rights, and they want them to be fulfilled. That is why the parties also want to address these human rights consistently. And it is not only because they are forced to do so by the fact that they want to appeal to most people. It is also because it is their own ideology that combines Sharia law with the rights for women and minorities. We have to understand that politicians are not disconnected from society. They rather represent it fully. Now I will move to the third point of my speech, which is the corrective mechanisms. And we can see that these corrective mechanisms are various. First of all, these are the internal corrective mechanisms. The first corrective mechanism in every single political system is the people themselves. The people who are willing, who are willing to go and demonstrate if the government doesn't do what they believe is right. Just as we saw after Hosni Mubarak was deposed, and the military junta that, I'll take you in a second, that gained power didn't do necessary democratic transitions, the people went to Tahrir Square again and protested. Yes?
So the popular movement that brought change to Iran was the same one that could have actually toppled the Ayatollah?
Thank you for your point. I believe it is irrelevant because the religious elements in Iran didn't actually get elected to the government in the first place. It was a coup d'etat after a coup d'etat. So this point is completely irrelevant. Now, another form of corrective mechanism is the other internal corrective mechanism, and that is coalition parties and just general political life. What we believe is that, first of all, policies are debated about from various points of view, and it is not only from the religious point of view, but also from the practical point of view. And second of all, these parties have necessity to cooperate with others. And so we could see that in Tunisia, the Ennahda party formed a coalition with two parties that were liberal and secular. And this ensures that the constitution that is now currently being written in Tunisia is all right. And we can see this similar mechanism in work, for example, in Turkey, where we now have an Islamic party in force, and we can see that the party basically cannot impose any human rights violations because the people wouldn't disagree with it, the parliament wouldn't vote for it, and the constitutional court would ban those things. And the other point is about external corrective mechanisms, and this point basically says that European Union, as the greatest trade partner of these countries, has great leverage on the policy that is going on in these in these countries, and it is bound to use it, because the European Union is a force which tries to protect democracy and freedom of people, as we have witnessed it doing in the last couple of months. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, for the proposition to win this debate, they should have showed us several things. And the most important thing they should have shown us, and something that they themselves put as a burden of proof upon their team, was that this motion would lead to democracy, would lead to a democratic and free regime. In my speech, ladies and gentlemen, I will first tackle this point of democracy that was brought into the debate by both the proposition and the opposition. Then I will look at the question of moderacy versus radicalization and whether these religious parties are truly a threat to freedom. And after that, I will look at the point of effectiveness. So moving on to democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition seems not to understand what democracy is. Democracy is a representation of the people. It's a system in which people can finally express their opinions in elections. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion that the proposition wants to put into practice is a motion that kills democracy by excluding the majority of the people from the democratic process, ladies and gentlemen. This is no different from the dictatorial regime that these countries have gotten rid of, ladies and gentlemen. The dictatorial regime that ostensibly served as a great source of stability for the region, but proved to be extremely unstable because it oppressed the people, because it oppressed their values and their opinions. And this is what the proposition wants to do again. This is what the proposition is actually in practice striving for, ladies and gentlemen, because democracy is a system in which these people deserve to be represented. So the proposition is, in the long run, not for democracy, but against it. Moving on to the second point of moderacy versus radicalization. We saw a great deal of throwing of quotes from one side and the other side, ladies and gentlemen. But the most important thing here is that we have seen a trend in the long term, and there was an analysis on the side of the opposition of why these countries, why these parties moderatize, why these parties liberalize over the course of years, ladies and gentlemen. And this is something that happens in society as well. People are changing, their values are changing. Islam is interpreted differently over the course of time, ladies and gentlemen. And this is something that the people want. The people want freedom. There is a civil society in these countries that is extremely active, which we pointed out in the example, for example, of Egypt, where the people protested against what looked like a new dictatorial regime coming their way when the army seemed not to yield power, ladies and gentlemen. And if this were to happen, the people would come out into the streets again and protest, forcing the radical parties to move away. Because if they didn't, if a new civil war was to occur, that is where our split arguments comes into play, ladies and gentlemen, with something that has already happened with Libya in this past year, when the European Union put sanctions on it, ladies and gentlemen. So because we believe that these parties are in itself moderate, and they also have good reason to not be extreme because of their coalitions inside, and because of these forces that are international, they're a threat to freedom. And the third point, ladies and gentlemen, that was never tackled by the proposition is effectiveness. We firstly talked about the point that there is no difference, that this motion would actually do nothing, ladies and gentlemen. The only thing to which they said was, well, we can ban that party again. But ladies and gentlemen, it is not that simple, and of course also, the people, even if they change that part in their program, would still be the same if they were truly radical, which we say, ladies and gentlemen, they are not. The only thing they said to the point of radicalization, which was the sub-point of the effectiveness argument, ladies and gentlemen, was that, well, if these parties would want to gain power anyway, that means they are very violent. No, ladies and gentlemen, that means that does that mean that the whole population of all of these countries in North Africa are extremely violent because they protested against a regime that oppressed them? Ladies and gentlemen, no. These people want to be able to express their opinions. These people want to be able to live in a free regime. And we, as the opposition, are the only team in this debate that is giving them democracy, that is giving them chance to show that they are moderate, and that actually does something effective in these newly democratized Arab nations.